evolutionary psychology by two folks that I know well, one of whom is a friend of mine, Randy Thornhill, where they asked women to rate the pleasantness of t-shirts that were worn by men. And it turns out that the one that they judge as most pleasing of olfactorily speaking is the one that is also identifying the guy who is the most symmetric. So in other words, there is sensorial convergence so that two independent senses are arriving at the same final product, in this case the product being the optimal male for me to choose, and it would make perfect evolutionary sense for there to be that sensorial convergence. So
right, and in the book you introduce the nomological network, which isn't discussed very frequently in books that are written popularly, right? That's an idea that hasn't been discussed much outside of specialty courses, say in methodology, in psychology. I actually think the psychologists came up with the idea of nomological network.
Yeah, so I'm going to describe what you just said and tell you how my approach of nomological networks is grander, if you'd like. So the folks who came up with the term nomological networks in psychology were coming up with a nomological network of triangulated evidence when establishing the validity of a psychological construct, right? So when you're establishing convergent validity and discriminant validity, right? The Campbell and Fisk stuff, which, by the way, if there are any graduate students in psychology, never mind graduate students in psychology, any student should read the 1959 paper, the multi-trait, multi-method matrix by Campbell and Fisk. It's one of the most
right, and there's an earlier one as well by Cronbach and Meehl in 1955.
Exactly, very good.
Struck validity in psychological tests.
Exactly.
Right, and it was part of the American Psychological Association's efforts to develop standards for psychological testing. So it is, in fact, a method of defining what's real. How do you know that something's real? And that's what a normal...
So if each of these validity constructs points to ticking off this construct as being valid, then I've now, in a nomological network sense, established the veracity of that construct, the validity of that construct.
Right, and that's actually something a bit different than a pragmatic a proof of truth. Because from the pragmatic perspective, the theory is evaluated with regards to its utility as a tool. This is more like an analogy to sensory reality.
Exactly.
If something registers across multiple different methods of detecting it, it's probably real.
Detecting it across cultures, across space, across time, across methodologies, across paradigms. So it's really the granddaddy of nomological networks. If Cronbach and Campbell and Fisk were talking in a more limited sense of how do you validate a psychological construct, this is saying how do you validate the veracity of a phenomenon? How do I establish that toy preferences are not singularly socially constructed? How can I establish that? So maybe...
Right, and you do that by studying primates, for example.
You study primates. So now here I'm doing across species. Now I'm going to do across cultures. Now I'm going to do across time periods.
And then you might look at androgenized versus non-androgenized children, and you can look across variation in hormonal status.
I am so delighted by how closely you've read the book. I am honored, my good man, that you're exactly right. And so if one box within my nomological network did not convince you, oftentimes the data in that one box is sufficient to convince you. But if it isn't, then by assiduously building that entire network, I'm gonna drown you in a tsunami of evidence. And so I consider this an incredibly powerful way to adjudicate between and so, by the way, this is why in the book I demonstrate that it is not only used for scientific phenomena or evolutionary phenomena. By building a nomological network for the question of, is Islam a peaceful religion or not? In other words, I could use this grand epistemological tool to tackle important phenomena, even if they are outside the realm of science. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. Well, it's a matter of... So to put it simply, it's a matter of collecting evidence. Okay. If you study if you approach a phenomenon from one perspective, you might see a pattern there. But then the question is, are you seeing that pattern because of your method, or are you seeing that pattern, like, are you reading into the data, or are the data revealing the pattern? Exactly. And the answer to that is, with one methodology, you don't know.
Exactly.
So what you want to do is use multiple methodologies, and the more separate they are in their approach, the better. And so when I wrote Maps of Meaning, which was my first book, I was looking for patterns, but I was skeptical of it. I wanted to ensure that the patterns I was looking at sociologically and in literature and were also manifest in psychology and in neuroscience. And I thought that gave me the ability to use 4 dimensions of triangulation, so to speak.
Right.
And the claim was, well, if the pattern emerges across these disparate modes of approach, it's probably, there's a higher probability that it's real. And so a psychology that's biologically informed is going to be richer than one that isn't, because your theory has to not only account for behavior, let's say, in the instance, but it also has to be in accord with what's currently known about the function of the brain.
Exactly.
And that's the approach that you're taking to analysis of business problems.
Exactly. And by the way, it is truly a liberating way to view the world, because it allows you, in a sense, so if you have epistemic humility, you're able to say, if now you, Jordan, you were to ask me, hey, in Canada, Justin Trudeau passed the laws legalizing cannabis. What do you think of those laws? Well, then I would say, you know what? I have epistemic humility. I simply don't know enough. I haven't built the requisite nomological network to pronounce a definitive position on this. On the other hand, if you ask me a question on a phenomenon for which I have built my nomological network, then I could enter that debate and that conversation with all the epistemic swagger that I'm afforded by the protection of having built that nomological network. So it's a really wonderful way to view the world, because it allows me to exactly know when I can engage an issue with well-deserved self-assuredness, and when I should say, I really just don't know enough about this topic. And by the way, and someone like you, who has of course also been a professor for many years, if you establish that epistemic honesty with your students, it's actually quite powerful, because if an undergraduate student asks me a question and in front of everyone I say, wow, you really stumped me with that question. You know what? Why don't you send me an email and let me look into it? What that does is it builds trust with those students, because it's saying this guy is not standing up in front of us pretending to know everything. As a matter of fact, he was willing to admit that he was stumped by the student of a 20-year-old.
Okay, so